China's written history extends back at least 3,000 years, making it the world's oldest continuous civilization. Now the most heavily populated country on Earth, with more than 1 billion citizens, this Far Eastern nation is proud of a heritage that includes some of the world's finest works of art and literature. Ancient China remained untouched by foreign influences for thousands of years. Isolated by mountain ranges and vast deserts, the Chinese did not even realize that other civilizations existed until 126 BC. The ancient Chinese were originally hunters and fishers. They lived along the Huanghe and Gongzhong rivers in northern and central China as early as 5000 BC. They settled in these fertile regions and became farmers. The Chinese civilization grew and thrived over thousands of years and developed its own culture of arts, philosophy, and science. For more than 2,000 years, a 6th century philosopher shaped Chinese thought. This influential thinker, named Confucius, believed that subjects must blindly follow their ruler, and that sons and daughters must maintain strict allegiance to their parents. In some ways, the lives of people in Chinese villages today are not very different from those of their ancestors 2,000 years ago.
This map shows China's boundaries at different stages in its history. In 600 BC, the Zhou dynasty ruled an unsettled and divided country, but by 100 BC, the Han dynasty controlled a strongly united China. Under the Tang dynasty in 750 AD, China expanded greatly, but by 1400 it had lost some of this land. The Great Wall was built over 2,000 years ago to keep out the warlike people to the north.
Family was very important to the ancient Chinese. 3 generations of the same family usually lived under the same roof. The head of the family, usually the grandfather, lived in the main building with his wife and children, while the rest of the family occupied side rooms. In ancient China, when a boy was 20 and a girl was 15, they were ready to be married. The boy was now considered an adult and was allowed to worship his ancestors and have sons to continue the family. Marriages were arranged after a fortune teller declared that the couple were suited to each other. The dead ancestors and living relatives of the bride and groom were also consulted, and a date for the wedding was set. The wedding was a big celebration. The couple were tied together with a red thread and drank from the same cup to show their unity. Once a woman was married, she was expected to obey her husband and her new parents-in-law.
Births were times of celebration. When a woman became pregnant, her parents would send her flowers, foods, sweets, and clothes for the baby. When a boy was born, he received a piece of jade, and his father hung a bow on the doorway of the home. When a girl was born, she received a curved roof tile to ward off evil spirits, and the parents displayed a handkerchief. Both boys and girls received additional gifts when they were 100 days old.
Family was very important to the ancient Chinese. 3 generations of the same family usually lived under the same roof. The head of the family, usually the grandfather, lived in the main building with his wife and children, while the rest of the family occupied side rooms. Family life was governed by strict rules. Without exception, mothers and fathers brought up their sons and daughters to be gentle, friendly, polite, and obedient. Youngsters learned at a young age to refrain from answering back to adults or sitting when someone older was standing. Chinese parents never beat their children, but they did frighten them with stories about ghosts, such as Big Eyes Yang or Liu the Barbarian.
In the Chinese household, everyone got up at dawn. Once they were up, the children had to gather up their pillows and mats and put them out to air. They had to sprinkle the floors of the rooms and courtyards with water and sweep them out.
Education was important in ancient China. Boys usually went to school at the age of 7, or if their parents were rich, they hired a private tutor. In some cities, the richest children went to school between the ages of 7 and 13. They would learn to write 20 Chinese characters a day. Girls were not usually sent to school. They learned to spin, weave, and embroider, and they helped their mothers at home.
Chinese children were taught to be polite and obedient. Each day they had a list of tasks that must be done. Once the tasks were completed, the children were free to play. The children would play with musical instruments, masks, or puzzles. They also enjoyed kite flying. Kites were made out of silk and bamboo and were in the shape of butterflies, birds, or fish. Other favorite games included walking on stilts and playing marbles.
In China, dinner time was not a family occasion. The men and boys ate first. The food was served in small pieces of dishware, so it could be eaten with chopsticks. They also held their bowls close to their mouths to avoid dropping food. The women were in charge of preparing the meal.
Poor people lived on a diet of rice, cabbage, and a little pork and bean curd. Their cooking utensils were roughly made. Rich men and women had a greater variety of food. They steamed meats and vegetables in bamboo containers, fried them in shallow pans, and roasted them on spits. Their cups, plates, and dishes were handcrafted pottery. Both rich and poor people ate with chopsticks or spoons. To make eating easier, women cut food into small pieces and taught their children to hold their bowls near their mouths to avoid dripping.
Tea has been grown in China since the 2nd century BC. Since that time, tea making has become a fine art. At first, boiled water was poured onto powdered tea in a bowl, and the tea was drunk from these bowls. Later, by about the 13th century, tea makers began steeping leaves in hot water using a teapot. The 3 main types of tea were black, oolong, and green. During the summer, small children in ancient China often wore only an apron tied at the waist and the neck. By the time they were 3 or 4, they dressed the same way as adults. Both men and women usually wore a robe or tunic over trousers. Wealthy people wore leather shoes or silk slippers, while poorer Chinese had wooden clogs or straw sandals. In winter, everyone relied on clothes rather than heat to keep warm. As a result, thick quilted coats were popular with men and women of all ages. Clothing among the rich and poor Chinese people was very different. Poor peasant farmers wore tunics and trousers made of hemp, a rough fabric made of plant fibers. The wealthy enjoyed beautifully decorated robes of silk.
Decorations on clothes were seen as protection against evil spirits. Sons were thought to be especially important and had to wear clothes in the lucky colors of red and pink. Charms were also important. Jewelry was also used to show a person's rank in society. Wealthy women decorated their hair with combs and hairpins made of silver and gold. Belt hooks and plaques were the most important pieces of jewelry for men. The Chinese believed that ghosts and spirits could harm them, especially children. Decorations on clothing were believed to protect children against evil spirits. Parents would dress their children in shoes, hats, and collars with designs of tigers, dogs, or pigs to scare away evil spirits. Children also wore charms. Chinese boys would wear plain metal necklaces like dog collars to fool the evil spirits into thinking they were dogs. Earrings and anklets were also worn as protection. Parents often tied their children's hair with red ribbons, which they thought to be lucky. Most peasant farmers lived on family-owned plots of land, paid taxes, and worked on public works, like roads, on certain days of the year. The life of a farmer was difficult. Farming jobs were done by hand, and the family was responsible for finding a way to bring water to their crops. They either carried water in buckets or used a human-powered irrigation machine. Both boys and girls helped grind the rice for cooking.
Many people of ancient China were farmers. Even the youngest children helped to work on the farm. Children would look after work animals like the buffalo. The buffalo were used for plowing the fields. Rice was the main crop of South and Central China, while wheat was grown in the north. During the rice-growing season, children helped transplant seedlings and hoe and weed them as they grew. When the rice was ripe, children guarded the fields with clappers to frighten away the birds. After the harvest, the rice straw was gathered together and used for thatch, mats, and sandals.
City life was busy in China. Along the main streets were open-fronted shops selling almost anything you could want. Food, clothes, jewelry, and books were all sold in the streets. Even children sold food from trays. Sometimes you could see acrobats, musicians, and jugglers performing in the streets.
City life was lively and busy. Along the main streets were open-fronted shops selling food, clothes, jewelry, and books. Sometimes you might see acrobats, musicians, and jugglers. Much of what we know about ancient Chinese cities comes from the tales of Marco Polo, the Italian merchant who traveled to China in the 13th century. Towns and cities were built on a grid system, and each section was called a ward. Walls surrounded each ward, and its gates were locked every night. The wealthy and important government people lived at one end of the city, far away from the poor. Cities were the centers of government, trade, and commerce. Peasant farmers brought their goods to market, and the main streets became lined stalls, selling all kinds of produce.
According to the Chinese, a person becomes sick when the opposing forces of yin and yang become unbalanced. Traditional Chinese medicine makes use of herbs, acupuncture, and a balanced diet to remedy this. The Chinese have been interested in medicine for thousands of years. After the time of the Tang dynasty, Chinese doctors had to be examined on their knowledge. In 1111, all of the knowledge of the medical profession was taken down in what became the standard reference book for Chinese medicine.
Acupuncture has been used to treat illness for over 2,000 years. An acupuncturist inserts needles at different points on the body to relieve pain or to treat illness. In current times, doctors have found that acupuncture can be used as an anesthetic in surgery. During an operation in which acupuncture is used, a patient can stay conscious without feeling much pain.
Herbs have been used to treat a variety of ailments in China for thousands of years. Herbs like mulberry, Chinese yam, wolfberry, and bugbane have been used not only in medicine, but also in Chinese cooking in order to ensure a healthy family. Some popular Chinese herbs include teasel root, which soothes the rheumatic pain and heals broken bones; mulberry, which helps inner ear problems and dizziness; chain fern bark, which helps stiffness and lower back pain; Chinese yam, which treats fatigue and loss of appetite; bugbane rhizome, used to treat the common cold; and wolfberry, which was used to help improve the eyesight. Throughout its history, the Chinese Empire was known to be tolerant of all religions. Although there were often disagreements over different religious theories, very few people were ever punished for their beliefs. The peaceful teachings of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism all came about in reaction to periods of constant battle in China.
The oldest religion in China is ancestor worship. Each person worships his or her own ancestors as gods. Offerings are made to the ancestors at festivals, and their advice is asked in making decisions.
One of the most important of the Chinese religions was Confucianism, which was based on the teachings of Confucius, who lived from 551 to 479 BC. Confucius's outlook grew as a result of the disorder he saw around him. His philosophies were based on kindness, obedience, and respect. He taught that rulers should deal fairly with their subjects in order to encourage respect and obedience. Confucius also stressed the importance of a strong family. Family members were encouraged to respect each other because he believed a strong society had at its core a strong family.
Taoists were the followers of Lao Tzu, who taught that people should live in harmony with the natural world. He stressed the importance of living a simple life and maintaining a balance with nature. Lao Tzu disagreed with the importance Confucius placed on allegiance to one's family and state. He did not believe in regulations and taught that no action was the best way to live. Taoists worshipped 8 mysterious immortals called Xian, who lived in the mountains. They were thought to have magical powers, such as the ability to turn ordinary metals into gold. Buddhism came to China from India in the 1st century AD. Buddhists followed the teachings of a North Indian prince called Buddha, or Enlightened One, who was born around 563 BC. He believed that one could achieve a state of bliss, or nirvana, by giving up worldly pleasures. The endless cycle of birth and rebirth, the Buddhists believed, could only be broken when a state of nirvana was reached. A bad person, on the other hand, could be reborn many times and in many forms.
One image that turns up again and again in China is the Maitreya, the Buddha of the future. According to some, the Maitreya will be born on Earth 5,000 years after the death of the historical Buddha. Some believe that he will appear any time the world is in danger. The Kuan Yin, or Buddhist god or goddess of mercy, is also the protector of children. They are especially known for their compassion. A bodhisattva, or enlightened being, gave up all hope of eternal peace in order to help others find salvation.
The first emperor built a tomb for himself that was guarded by thousands of life-size terracotta soldiers. Each soldier was created with a different face and was joined by life-size horses and chariots. The range of Chinese crafts was enormous, so much so that luxury items were one of China's most important exports. In the cities, a family might own a small shop and make kites, puppets, or lacquered furniture. Some craftsmen, like clog makers, worked in the streets or marketplace. Most craftsmen were organized into groups called guilds. Some of the most skilled craftsmen made fine things for the emperor's court and the nobles. They made beautifully decorated plates, bowls, and vases from porcelain. Most workshops produced simpler goods made from bamboo, wood, and earthenware. Music was an important part of life in China. Music was often played at the imperial palace to accompany important occasions and religious ceremonies. Confucius thought that playing an instrument could help the player achieve a state of inner harmony. The Chinese played many different string and wind instruments, including flutes, mouth organs made of bamboo, and lutes. The most popular type of theater in China was the opera. Chinese operas were usually based on important historical events.
In ancient China, gardens were viewed as works of art. Gardens were meant to appear as if they were a natural paradise, and often contained lakes or ponds. Trees and plants were allowed to grow in natural clumps and shapes, as they would in the wild. Gardens were places of tranquility that encouraged quiet reflection. They were places where one could study nature and get away from the turmoil of daily life. The Chinese loved flowers. Some of the most well-known flowers included the lotus, a flower of summer which symbolized purity, the peony, which was a symbol of spring, the chrysanthemum, which, because it was able to outlast the frost, came to symbolize long life, and the narcissus, which brought good luck.
Another ancient craft was the keeping of silkworms. Weaving and embroidering cotton and silk were important crafts in the country. Women usually did this, although in the towns men and boys also sewed in special workshops. The Chinese started making silk from around 3000 BC. It later became a state industry, and artisans were able to produce large amounts of fine silk for the wealthy people of China and for export.
Children and adults in ancient China liked to play games and have fun. After finishing morning chores, children were free to play. Smaller children played with animal rag dolls. Older children often amused themselves with clay figures, musical instruments, masks, or puzzles. There were also Chinese versions of chess, checkers, and football. Kite flying was popular with people of all ages. Some had bamboo pipes which made a noise when they were flying. The Chinese invented playing cards and enjoyed playing card games and other games of chance, including dice.
There were many festivals and ceremonies in ancient China. One of the most important and largest celebrations was the New Year festival. This festival went on for 15 days, during which time family members exchanged gifts and feasted together. The dragon, which brought happiness and good luck, was a symbol of the festival of the New Year. The Qingming was another important festival for the Chinese family.
The Qingming was another important festival for the Chinese family. During this festival, family members cleaned the graves of their ancestors and left offerings of food for their spirits.
China's landscape was dotted with walled cities and towns that were built on a grid system. The big cities had wide main streets with a maze of narrow alleys behind them. Along the main streets were open-fronted shops. The emperors, along with members of the court, nobles, and foreign merchants, lived in walled cities within larger cities. The walls of the city were built in a square shape and symbolized the four corners of the earth.
Homes in ancient China varied in design. Some were rectangular, and others were square with a courtyard inside. But all homes were built from the same materials: wood, bamboo, brick, and tiles. Most houses had upturned corners on the roofs to keep away demons and to protect the house from harsh weather. Roofs were made of heavy pottery tiles and were supported by sturdy wooden beams which allowed for movement in case of an earthquake. These tiles were sometimes decorated to ward off evil spirits. Inside the home, rooms were furnished with low tables, chairs, stools, and cupboards, all made of bamboo or blackwood. Bamboo mats or animal skins covered the floors in poorer houses, while richer people had woolen carpets. Both adults and children slept on mats made from rushes or padded cotton, with pillows made of wood rather than a cushion. The traditional Chinese home had an inner courtyard, which was the family's meeting place. The courtyard could also be used as a working area, where grain was threshed and dried on mats. Separate food storage rooms were built on stilts to protect the grain from rats and damp. Vegetables were also grown in the courtyard, hedged off by a bamboo fence. One of the most striking buildings in a Chinese town was the pagoda. The pagoda was built as a sacred Buddhist tower and had from 3 to 15 beautifully decorated tiers. The pagoda was thought to bring good luck to the area around it.
China is an enormous country, and its people used many different methods to travel. Water transport was particularly important. The two great rivers of ancient China, the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, were linked by the Grand Canal. This great waterway stretched across the Chinese Empire and was used to transport rice to the imperial capital. Some of the larger towns were linked by canals big enough to take seagoing boats. There were barges and bigger boats called junks that sailed along the rivers and canals and traded at the towns they passed. When the canals of the north froze in winter, the boats were fitted with sledge runners and poled along.
The traditional Chinese sailing vessel was the junk. These large seagoing ships could weigh up to 1,500 tons and could carry a huge cargo long before such ships were being built in Europe.
The most important boat on China's many waterways was the sampan. The sampan was made in a variety of styles, but they all had the same basic flat-bottomed design.
Ferry boats or water taxis were used to carry passengers from one part of the city to another, or across the river or canal.
Carts were used by country people to carry produce and people. The carts were pulled by oxen, donkeys, or horses. Rich men traveled on horseback, while women and children were carried in sedan chairs. Government officials had light two-wheeled carriages pulled by one horse.
The Grand Canal was built during the Sui dynasty by the Emperor Yangdi. This great waterway ran from the Yangtze River in the south to Beijing and the Yellow River in the north, and traveled a distance of 1,500 miles.
The wheelbarrow was invented by the ancient Chinese. Their wheelbarrows had 1 or 2 wheels and were usually pulled by a man with a rope at the front. A wheelbarrow might even have a sail to help it on its way. The Han Emperor, Gaozu, created the first imperial civil service. Gaozu was the leader of the peasant army that overthrew the Qin dynasty in 207 BC. Although an uneducated man himself, Gaozu recognized the need for educated administrators and gathered a group of scholars to form his civil service. Later, civil servants could attend a university where they studied the ancient Confucian classics. Those who graduated took posts in local, provincial, or national government. Those who went on to pass the top palace exams could be appointed ministers. Prefects in local districts performed most of the civil service work. They were responsible for their city and its surrounding lands. Prefects were in charge of keeping peace, collecting taxes, organizing labor for public works, supervising schools, and judging law cases.
The Forbidden City in Beijing was a splendid palace built by the Ming Emperor Yongle. Only the most important officials and ministers were allowed to enter the Forbidden City. Trade was very important in ancient China. From the 1st century A.D., a famous trading route called the Silk Road stretched from China to the Mediterranean Sea. Many Chinese products like silk, spices, teas, porcelain, and lacquerware reached Europe along this and other overland routes. From the early 16th century, European ships sailed to China to trade. Chinese tea became popular in many parts of Europe and Asia.
The range of Chinese crafts was enormous, so much so that luxury items were one of China's most important exports. In the cities, a family might own a small shop and make kites, puppets, or lacquered furniture. Some craftsmen, like clogmakers, worked in the streets or marketplaces. Most craftsmen were organized into groups, called guilds. The Shang dynasty was China's first great dynasty. Shang kings ruled a large part of northern China, the center of the dynasty being the fertile region around the Yellow River. The chief responsibilities of the Shang ruler, or Son of Heaven as he was called, was to keep good relations between heaven and earth. To accomplish this, he consulted the royal ancestors in making decisions for the good of the dynasty. The Zhou rulers also practiced ancestor worship. Their society was set up as a feudal system in which peasant farmers cultivated the lands of their powerful lords. By the end of the Zhou dynasty, wars broke out between the feudal lords, and China was divided into 7 different states. In 221 BC, Qin soldiers defeated their enemies and united China's separate states into one empire under the leader Jiang. The first sovereign of the Qin Empire, who reigned from 221 to 207 BC, used slaves to build the Great Wall in about 214 BC to keep out invaders. The Great Wall became the longest structure ever built. The rulers of the Han Dynasty established the civil service that ran China for over 2,000 years. Gaozu, the first ruler of the Han Dynasty, led the peasants who overthrew the Qin Dynasty. Although uneducated himself, Gaozu brought together scholars to form the imperial civil service. After a period in which China was again divided into separate states, it was finally united under the Sui Dynasty. The Sui rulers strengthened the Great Wall and also built the Grand Canal, which connected the Yangtze and the Yellow Rivers. Under the Tang emperors, China expanded to become a world power. China prospered during this time, and art and trade flourished. China was divided into north and south under the period called the 5 Dynasties. The southern part of China was divided into small states which continued to prosper, while the north fell under foreign rule. China was again united under the Song Dynasty. Advances were made in science and technology under the Song rulers, who were also great patrons of the arts. Mongol invaders conquered the Chinese by 1279 AD and established their own dynasty called the Yuan. International trade thrived under the Mongols, who then controlled the entire length of the Silk Road. The Chinese finally drove the Mongols out of China in 1368 and established the last Chinese dynasty, the Ming. Ming emperors made improvements on the Great Wall and the Grand Canal and set up a capital in Beijing. Culture again flourished, and the Ming dynasty became famous for its beautiful works of art.
In times when foreign invasion was a constant threat, common people were recruited into the army. Unlike some other early civilizations, however, China never made militarism into a cultural phenomenon. During the period from 403 to 221 BC, rival kingdoms fought for control of China so often that historians call the era warring states. Soldiers using weapons, armor, and chariot fittings made of bronze took part in fierce battles. Civil wars broke out in the 10th and 13th centuries. The Chinese court had to abandon North China when Mongol power grew there and throughout the world.
The Chinese dragon, or long, embodied strength, goodness, and wisdom, and was thought to live in the clouds and in every body of water. Above all, the dragon came to symbolize the life-giving force of water. It became the symbol of Chinese emperors during the reign of the first emperor. He used the dragon as his emblem because dragons were the lords of the water, and the Qin thought of water as their lucky element.
Chinese emperors valued good horses. The Emperor Taizong, for example, commissioned portraits of his 6 favorite horses. The emperor rode these horses into many great battles. Each horse can be identified in the portraits by the position of his arrow wound. In this portrait, the emperor's general pulls an arrow from the chest of Autumn Dew. Originally, rulers were buried with their whole entourage, including their favorite horses. Later, however, ceramic and bronze figures were substituted for the real thing.
In battle, the Chinese rode wooden chariots which carried a charioteer, an archer, and a halberdier, and were led by 2 or 4 horses. Managing a chariot was an important skill for a noble. Ornately decorated chariots were important status symbols and were buried with their owners along with the horses and charioteers. Chariots were often used after battles were over, but they were abandoned as weapons of war by 221 BC.
The Chinese invented one of the most deadly weapons of the time before 450 BC, the crossbow. Its short, heavy arrows were called bolts and could be fired with great force. The crossbow brought about the decline of the use of chariots in battle. Crossbows could be fired at an enemy from a safe distance so that chariot raids were no longer necessary.
Hand-to-hand combat between foot soldiers decided the outcome of most battles. Fierce Chinese warriors carried daggers and swords made of bronze, which could be made much sharper than iron. Axes were also dangerous weapons, along with the chief weapon of war, the halberd.
The halberd was a blade, usually made of bronze, that was attached to a bamboo pole. These long poles allowed a halberdier to strike an enemy from a distance. Halberdiers were part of a chariot's team and helped to protect the horses.
Chinese soldiers sometimes wore armor made from scales of leather. During the time of the warring states, armor was made of iron plates. Some Qin soldiers were so fearless that they removed their armor during battles so that they could swing their weapons more easily.
As the Zhou dynasty declined, feudal lords began to fight against each other for power, and China became separated into 7 warring states. Over a period of more than 200 years, hundreds of thousands of men were killed in battle. During this time, Sun Tzu wrote the world's oldest military handbook, The Art of War, which gave military advice to nobles. Finally, the state of Qin was able to unite the separate states into one empire. Eventually, the peaceful ideas of Confucius became popular, and the military declined in favor of the civil service.
Throughout China's history, emperors encouraged the development of science and technology. For hundreds of years, China led the way with new inventions in these areas. The Chinese invented printing and paper, which greatly improved communications. They invented the wheelbarrow, or wooden ox, between 221 BC and 265 AD. The magnetic compass was invented by the Chinese and was used in navigation at sea. The rudder was invented by the Chinese between 205 BC and 220 AD and made steering of large ships possible for the first time. The Chinese were the first to develop iron casting and discover gunpowder. By the 10th century, gunpowder was being used in weapons, including the gun, which was also a Chinese invention. Other Chinese inventions include paper money, clockwork, porcelain, and silk.
Perhaps the most important Chinese inventions were paper and printing. Paper was first made from silk, but later, other materials like hemp and bamboo were used. Paper was eventually mass-produced in factories as the demand for it grew.
In about 100 BC, paper was invented in China. A mixture of fibrous material like bark or old rags was cooked into a thick pulp. A fine mesh was then dipped into the mixture, and the water was drained out of it. After the material had dried and become paper, it was removed from the mesh and brushed smooth on a hard surface. Wooden printing blocks were made to simplify the printing process.
By the 9th century, the Chinese had developed large-scale woodblock printing. This meant that 1 or 2 pages of a book were carved in reverse on a wooden block. The surface of the block was covered with ink, and a piece of paper was laid over it to make a print. Later, movable type was invented, but was so complicated that it did not entirely replace woodblock printing.
The earliest Chinese books were made of long strips of bamboo, which were tied together. Later, after the art of papermaking was developed, scholars wrote on long pieces of paper which were rolled up into a scroll. As books began to spread all over China, so did literacy. The most popular books were sacred Buddhist texts. In fact, the earliest known printed book was the Buddhist sacred text called the Diamond Sutra.
Chinese calligraphy, or writing, was a great art. There were thousands of symbols, each representing a different idea. According to legend, Chinese writing was invented over 4,000 years ago by an imperial official who figured out characters from the tracks of animals. Chinese characters are based on signs, not sounds, and each stroke must be drawn in the correct order. Chinese text is written in vertical columns and read from right to left. This writing system has hardly changed over 2,000 years.
Throughout history, China's rugged and vast landscape, along with poor communications and transportation, led to the isolation of many areas of the country. The spoken language in these areas developed differences called dialects. The 2 most important dialects today are Mandarin, which originated in the north of China, and Cantonese, which originated in the south. The differences between some dialects are often so great that speakers cannot understand each other.
Chinese does not have a regular alphabet like the languages of the West. Chinese characters are based on signs, not sounds. According to legend, Chinese writing was invented over 4,000 years ago by an imperial official who figured out characters from the tracks of animals. Each character is a picture and is made up of different strokes. Some characters can be traced back to early pictures. The meanings of most characters, however, do not relate to the picture. Each Chinese character is made up of 1 or more basic pieces called radicals. Each radical is a group of strokes that come from a basic word and is used to make up other words. Most words that contain a radical have a meaning related to that radical. For example, words that contain the radical for man will have something to do with people. Similarly, words that contain the radical for heart will have something to do with feelings. Sometimes, though, the meaning of a word has no connection to the meaning of its radical. In these cases, the pronunciation of the character might be similar to the pronunciation of the radical, but their meanings are totally different.
When local peasants brought their produce to market and their grain tax to be collected, the large transactions were often calculated on an abacus. The abacus is the earliest known computing instrument. Although its exact origins are not known, it is thought that the Chinese version of the abacus started in Central or Western Asia and was based on the one used by the Romans. There is a reference to a 6th century Chinese abacus made up of counters which were rolled in grooves. By the time of the Ming Dynasty, an abacus made of beads was used all over China. In many ways, ancient Chinese culture continues today in many rural villages, much as it did 3,000 years ago. Until recently, China's public policy was focused more on maintaining past tradition than on looking to the future. The last Chinese dynasty, the Ming, was overthrown by people from north of the Great Wall. The Manchu, or Qing dynasty, occupied the throne until they were overthrown in 1911 in favor of a Chinese republic. The last Qing emperor, Pu Yi, stepped down in 1912, bringing 2,000 years of imperial history to an end.